Discussing the three paid sick day bills that are on the agenda today. And I understand that there are three versions of the bill because there's some disagreement over what the final product might someday look like. Plus, I think there is a desire on behalf of the majority to have both a House and a Senate vehicle so that it could start in either chamber if necessary. And that's their prerogative. I prefer to keep things to one bill. Might make things simpler for us to actually use the committee process for what it's intended for, which is to actually debate and refine the language of the bills that we work on, instead of simply advancing multiple vehicles, which are very likely to morph into something else before we ever even vote on it on the floor. It kind of makes the process here extremely frustrating for someone serving in the minority, because I know I'm debating a bill that I may not even see. I've got to prepare for that. The last couple of agendas we've had in this committee have had substantial amounts of substitute language, which we get. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but I appreciate the fact that we're getting it the day before. But that's not good enough, really, and I don't think it's fair to the public, because that language is often not made public either. There are people right now watching this committee meeting, very interested in this debate, and they can't even look at the bill that we're going to be debating and voting on because there's a lot of substitute language out there, and that's not made public. So just to refresh people's minds who are watching or maybe catching this in the middle, what we're voting on is an expansion of Connecticut's paid sick days statute, which is a mandate on businesses that operate in Connecticut currently with 50 or more employees that they must provide a certain amount of paid sick time. And the bill that's before us makes quite a few changes, but the most significant one, and I think the most onerous one, is to change the requirement from businesses that are 50 or more employees to businesses that have as little as one employee. My colleagues have already done a very good job of describing the language of the bill and the impact that such a change might have on business and industry in our state. And I think that's clear to anyone who thinks about it for a second, that obviously, a large company that has numerous employees can certainly fill a gap a lot easier if someone is missing with little notice than a small employer who maybe has a small retail store that has one employee, and that one employee is supposed to be watching the shop. That obviously is going to have a much larger impact on that person. And like the policy that generally comes out of this committee, it's very much one-sided. It uses the legislature as a means to collectively bargain on behalf of the employees in the state, which I don't think that's what the legislature is intended for. That's just one of the many themes that tends to reoccur on the bills that we have in this committee. But it is a very common one, and it's certainly quite prevalent in this situation. I have a couple of questions about the language of the bill, and then I'm going to kind of give my take in some more detail about what I think about this. A few questions came up to me, Madam Chairman, during the discussion. And a lot of things were answered as well, so I actually had a lot more questions, but I still have a few that I'd like to address. I think it is in Section 3 still, the section that starts on line 264. This is about the relationship between employers and employees, about how those employees are to indicate to the employer that they're taking the time off and what it was for. Can I ask a question first and foremost? Is there anything in this bill that says that the employee has to provide any notice at all to the employer that they're taking the time off?
On line 258, if you need to use paid sick leave, an employer may require advance notice not to exceed 7 days prior to the date such leave is to begin.
I appreciate that answer. I would ask you to read the next line of that same paragraph for me, if you would.
If the leave is not foreseeable, then an employer may require to give an employee to give notice of such intention as soon as practicable.
Understood. Which means that there really isn't a requirement. Even though there is a specification for 7 days, it immediately nullifies that in the next sentence, which just says the employer may require the employee to give notice as soon as practicable. And I assume the determination of what's practicable is left up to the employee in this particular case. I think it's also interesting that, we have another bill that we just passed out of this committee on a joint favorable report that says that employers have got to provide 2 weeks notice to employees about any change in their schedules at all. And in fact, if they don't do so, they're going to be penalized in numerous and significant ways. And so it's quite clear that there is intention here to put weight on the scale for one of the parties in these transactions. And very clearly, it's an intention to advance the employee and their interests ahead of the employer. And, I've mentioned many times in this committee that it's very frustrating that the bills break down this way, that it's the employer versus the employee all the time. And because most of us, I think, particularly people in the business world, do not look at the world that way. People that are in business together look at themselves very often as partners that are working on their mutual success. I know that any place that I've ever worked, I did not have an adversarial relationship with my employer. I was not trying to put them into a corner and treat them as an enemy to get what I wanted from them. I communicated with my employer directly and had a conversation about what our circumstances were and how I could improve my own circumstances and station in life through my employment with them. And they did the same with me. This type of legislation flies in the face of that. You are creating more division in our society every time you interfere with the ability of people to communicate with each other and to work things out. Moving on later in this section, this is a pretty lengthy series of paragraphs about what notice is required and so forth. But effectively, as I just pointed out, no notice is actually required. There's this thing about 7 days, but then it says, as long as it's, practicable. So that kind of nullifies that. So the employer is not really due any notice, which I'm not going to say is not reasonable in the circumstance that somebody is actually sick. But the fact of the matter is, I don't know that it even goes so far as to say that the employee has to provide any notice at all. They could just not show up. The way I'm reading this bill, and the employer still takes a chance if they decide that they want to have some sort of response to that circumstance. I'm trying to read my own notes here. On lines 273 through 275, it talks about what an employer can require from an employee. And really, I think it breaks down to if it's 3 or more days, maybe the employer has some recourse, some remedy to the employer. The chairman used that phrase. But if it's under 3 days, it doesn't look like they really have to do anything. This says a written statement from an employee affirming that such employee is using or has used paid sick leave for the purpose of said subdivision shall be considered reasonable documentation. So the employee gets to write a note, not a doctor, the employee themselves. Can I ask, Madam Chairman, if I was an employee and I just wrote a simple note that said I was out because I was sick, would that satisfy that requirement that's in the language of the bill?
I believe it would.
Yeah, thank you for that answer, Madam Chairman. And people wonder why there's no votes on these bills. Because that's absurd. And I think it's intentionally absurd. There is pushback from folks saying, you need to make this more fair. This is a very one-sided bill. And the response from the people crafting the bill is to insert language like that, which, intends to mollify those concerns. But it does nothing. It does nothing. There's really no recourse for the employer under those circumstances. And moving on under subsection 3, starting in lines 286 and so forth. So if the employee is out for 3 or more days and the employer, has concerns, maybe they suspect that the person is not out actually because they're sick, but for some other reason, and they ask them for some sort of documentation, this is what it says. It says if an employer requires an employee to provide documentation for paid sick leave under the section, and such employer does not offer health insurance to the employee, and I'll just remind folks that this bill is going to apply to all employees, including part-time and including very part-time employees. It says the employer shall pay all out-of-pocket expenses the employee incurs in obtaining this documentation. So, how is that realistic in this arrangement? That the employer has got to go through a mountain of hoops just to run their own business. There's a lot more to be said about the language of all 3 bills. And if one of them or more of them ends up before the Senate, we can certainly talk about the details of the language. But I just want to talk about this more generally for a few minutes. A few things. First off, I don't like this being called paid sick leave or paid sick days because it's not paid sick days. It's paid time off. There's very little in this bill that is going to require anyone to actually be sick or to verify that they are actually missing time from work for being sick. It's paid time off. And I'll also point out that, the folks that are pushing this bill are presenting it as if they're doing some very generous thing for employees across the state. And I'm telling you that they're not doing anything generous whatsoever. They're giving something that does not belong to them, first and foremost, which is the number one issue that I have with it. It's not yours to give. And by forcing someone else to give something that belongs to them to someone else does not make you generous. It doesn't make you kind. It doesn't make you moral or righteous. It means that you have very little respect for at least one party to the transaction. And I would say it means you have very little respect for our system of laws and justice, period, because our system is based on the idea that the people are in power and they have the sovereignty and the rights to make their own decisions. And people seem to think that when they're elected to this legislature that they can just come up here and decide how other people are going to live. And they're wrong. They shouldn't be doing that. And I long for the day that the courts finally get this right and start to push back on the ability of governments to be able to interfere in the freedom of private individuals to negotiate and come up with employment terms on their own. I talked a little bit about the themes associated with this committee. I think I already mentioned the notion of an antagonist relationship, and I know Representative Weir mentioned it also. That's not the way the world works. It really isn't. Now, I know that some folks in the majority that like this legislation, they come from a world of collective bargaining and union labor, but that's not the whole world, first and foremost. And I don't know that even in that world that there is necessarily a very strict and adversarial relationship between the unionized employees and the employer. They tend to negotiate and work things out amicably in most circumstances. And certainly when there is no collective bargaining going on, that happens all the time. I'll also remind this committee that, I think something I said the other day, which is that employment is a voluntary activity. The employee, if they don't like the terms, they don't need to be employed by that employer. And every employee and every employer has the opportunity to negotiate the terms of employment when they begin their relationship. And I say that kind of tongue-in-cheek, knowing that they don't really have the full authority to negotiate that because this body and the federal government have decided many things for them already. But everything that is decided for the parties eliminates a little bit of their freedom and ability to negotiate on their own behalf. And that should not be lost on people, even people that are getting a benefit. They should realize that they may have been getting a benefit, but they gave up something in exchange for that, and that was their own freedom to negotiate the terms of what they're getting. That freedom is what separates us from the rest of the world. In America, people are not born and then told that they're going to be royalty, or they're going to be middle class, or they're going to be slaves. In America, they tell people you are born equal with opportunity to be able to come and achieve anything you want. In other countries, that you might go to school and they might tell you what you're going to do for a job for your life. That's the way this is going. We have government telling you what your job's going to look like, what your compensation is going to be. You should be able to achieve anything, and you should be able to negotiate those terms yourself. Point in fact, this bill and many like it that go through this committee are effectively using the force of state government, which is the most powerful force we have, government, more powerful than any employer, more powerful than any individual. Government has the force of the military, the police, the court, jail. So when the government says you have to do something, there's nothing more threatening than that. And the majority is using that force, the state government force, to tell businesses that they have to comply. And they're effectively using this legislature to collectively bargain with the power of that force behind them. What an unbelievably scary thought. Is there any wonder when you start to compare Connecticut across the the realm of the entire United States, the other 49 states, where we stand as far as economic viability, friendliness to business, job opportunities? We end up near the bottom on that scale, and that is exactly why. I've already alluded to the other theme, private contracts. It's a private contract between the employer and the employee. It's between them. Those are free people. They should decide what the terms of that agreement are. And they can decide whether they want to sign up for it or not. One side of that contract, either side, it would be wrong in either case, but neither side should have the state sitting next to them with all of the force and power that I just mentioned to tell the other side what they have to do. I won't even get into a discussion of capitalism versus communism or Marxism, this is more aptly described as, because we've had the conversation so many times. But I'll just remind people that capitalism is what made America great. It is why we are still a great country, that we still have a mostly free economy where markets decide outcomes. And yes, they are not equal outcomes. But all other systems that strive for equal outcomes mean worse outcomes. The quality of life that we have in this country is a direct result of the freedom and the capitalism that has created the incentive for people to go out and achieve and make great things. There's also no free lunch, something I say in here all the time. And that is because, as I mentioned, the legislature doesn't have the power to give anyone anything. They only have the power to take it and to give it to someone else. They don't actually create anything. They're not actually making the paid sick days and handing them to people. They are taking them from someone else. And as I mentioned, that does not make anyone holier than thou. It does not make anyone moral or generous. It means that they have little respect for the parties involved. And the fact of the matter is that employers, if they are forced to comply with any particular requirement that is placed on them by state government, they're simply going to make up for it in some other way. And what will be lost in the process is two things. Well, three things. One is the freedom of those people to have chosen some other path. The second thing is the right of the employee to have negotiated something that they would have preferred to the paid sick days. Because since that's off the table now, and the employer has to give them the paid sick days, they cannot negotiate the value of those sick days in some other way. They can't negotiate that for, some other benefit, mileage or, different hours or God knows all the things that could come up in any type of employment that someone might want to negotiate with their employer. You are putting the employer in a box that they only have certain amount of things that they can actually work with now to negotiate with the employee. And therefore, the employee is not eligible to be able to negotiate for those terms that they would wish to have either. And the third thing is that we are diminishing the production in our society. These type of regulations tell businesses not to come here, not to expand here, and ultimately, even if they do, they're limited in the amount of production that can actually occur because they are busy complying with state government regulations by force. And I'll give you a quick example, which is that I'm a very small business person. I'm a realtor, an insurance agent. I own a couple of properties. And I often think that I want to hire an assistant to help me with these things, especially when I'm here busy at the Capitol. I need someone to fill in and answer some phone calls and take care of some paperwork for me. But I haven't hired somebody, and I will tell you the number one reason why is this place. It's because I can't imagine the amount of paperwork I'm going to have to do just to hire someone and pay them a wage to be my assistant. I won't be able to negotiate the terms that I want. I will have to follow a bunch of requirements in state law, fill out forms, comply with regulations and requirements about insurance, workers' compensation. I'm going to have to offer paid sick days. And I'm going to have to track all of that, too. That's one thing that we don't talk about enough of in these meetings is the amount of requirements that are put in these bills for employers to track everything. We're going to talk about the warehouse bill later. I mean, that's the worst part of that whole thing. You've got to keep records for all eternity about every step every person took in that business from the dawn of time. And we're going to track it. And if you don't have that, boy, the government will come knock you on the head. So let me just close by saying this. And that is that this bill's got a lot of problems. It's morally wrong. It interferes with people being able to negotiate the terms of their employment on their own. And it's unnecessary in our society. The market would determine how much certain employment is worth to employers, how much employees will take jobs for what type of pay. That all gets figured out by the marketplace. This interrupts that marketplace and not in a way that will be beneficial to anyone. And I think that's clear based on everything I've said so far. But the final thing that I would just say about this bill is that it is unbelievably arrogant, in my opinion. I mean, that's the thing that annoys me about it more than anything, is just how arrogant it is to think that people that by virtue of being elected as a state representative or a state senator, that they have the right to tell other people who live in this state, who work hard every day, doing whatever they do, that we can just decide at a moment's notice that we're going to stick our nose in their business and tell them what their employment agreement is. It's not our business, Madam Chairman. We should stay out of it. I'll be a no on this bill. Oh, actually, the first three bills. Thank you.